We might give the French a lot of grief these days, but at one time they were the preeminent military power of Europe, and one of the guns that helped get them there was the 1866 Chassepot.
Right at the end of our American Civil War, the entire world was aware of the advancement towards self-contained metallic cartridge and breech loading. You know, black powder had been the only propellant around since the dawn of time. And of course, it left what we call fouling, a thick residue in the barrel and the inner workings of any firearm that used it as a propellant. So finding ways around that involved opening the breech. Patrick Ferguson saw that in the 1770s with his Ferguson breech loading rifle. And so after a suitable period of ignoring what was obvious, military institutions began to actually advance towards that breech loading dynamic, especially with self-contained, metallic cartridges in the 1860s.
The 1866 model Chassepot rifle really marks the beginning of the shift from muzzle-loading, external hammered shoulder arms to a real bolt-action rifle. And this really came about with the French realizing that their archenemy, the German states, not Germany at that time, but the various German states, most of them had adopted the Prussian Gras needle gun as early as 1841, which had a bolt and had a separate cartridge. Now, of course, it was basically a combustible cartridge fired by a needle that went through it, and the French decided that we have to go the same route. But when they came up with this Chassepot, it was named for its inventor, it really was a step forward. The rifle was superior to the Gras needle gun.
It was very handy and much lighter than the Gras. To fire it, you actually had a cocking piece. You had to cock the piece on the back of the bolt. It was just a single lug of the bolt, by the way, for locking. And then you moved the bolt up, put the cartridge in, closed it, and the gun was ready to fire. For gas seal, which was always a problem with these self-contained semi-combustible cartridges, this had a rubber gasket, and it gave complete obturation. There was absolutely no gas leakage with the Chassepot.
So the mid-19th century is an interesting time for the development of the infantry rifle. Most militaries in the world at that point had figured out that percussion rifle muskets, not the way to win on the battlefield. So the French developed a rifle named after, its inventor, Antoine Chassepot. And it's an early bolt-action rifle, but it's not a bolt-action rifle like we think of a bolt-action rifle. It's really only got a single lug, and that's the root of the bolt handle. And it takes a cartridge, but not a metallic cartridge. It takes a self-contained cartridge that's combustible. That means when you pull the trigger, firing pin goes forward, everything combusts, everything goes down the barrel. So you're not extracting a piece of brass because there is no brass.
One of the things that emerged as a clear weakness of the German needle rifle's design was the fact that the primer was embedded into the base of the bullet at the very top of the cartridge itself. And what that meant was that the Nadelgewehr, or needle rifle, required an extra long firing pin that actually penetrated through the entire powder column to strike the primer. And the subsequent combustion made the metal really brittle, and these firing pins broke often enough that soldiers were issued with spares so that they could replace them in the field. The Chassepot improved upon this by moving the primer from the front of the paper cartridge to the rear, which meant that less of the firing pin was exposed to the gases created by the combustion of the cartridge.
By the time that the Franco-Prussian War breaks out in 1870, the French have about 1 million of these in the hands of their troops. So by the end of the war, Basically, the Germans had captured at least 500,000 of these Chassepot rifles from their French adversaries. They exported some to China, they exported some to Ethiopia. They even took them and shortened them into cavalry carbines, rechambered them into 11 millimeter Mauser, and issued them to the cavalry units in Saxony and in Bavaria.
The interesting thing about the Chassepot and its successor, the Gras, was that the inventor of the Gras realized that governments don't like to spend a lot of money, so if he could devise a firearm that fired a self-contained metallic cartridge that could be converted from the earlier Chassepots, that would be ideal, and that's exactly what he did. Hence the Gras rifle, which was a superb rifle in its own right. Interestingly enough, a lot of the Chassepots were converted, and then there were some Gras that, of course, were made from scratch. One of the big differences, aside from the cartridge, was that in the Chassepot you had to cock the piece before you fired it. With the Gras, all you had to do was raise the bolt, pull the bolt back, and it was ready to fire.